Hello and welcome to my workshop. So today we're starting a new project. It's going to be a 1964 military spec Jeep M677 FC. That's a mouthful, it's a lot there. Really excited for this, it's going to be a fun build, so let's get started. I start off with the Jeep grill mold. This is made by designing in Fusion 360 and then printing two pieces. It'd be much better to print as just one piece. My print bed isn't big enough for that. It's easy enough to just glue them together and a little bit of light sanding and you're ready to go. I've been doing a lot more in Fusion 360 as I get more comfortable with the tool. Many of the pieces were designed before I even finished sketching out the views. For the side, front and back, I was lucky enough to find a picture online that I could scale to the correct size. The top view was not available, so I just drew that by hand on some graph paper. I've found that the pictures, even the ones that are labeled as blueprints, are not completely accurate. This is why I take a lot of dimensions from each angle. Sometimes I just have to split the difference between them. As long as the final drawing looks right, I'm not too concerned with 100% accuracy. The first part, the grill, is vacuum formed and then cut down to a final shape. The plastic pulls into the grill pieces. This gives a nice line which can be scored with a razor knife. I cut the straight pieces with a razor knife, but leave the curved sections for a rotary tool. The most important thing to remember is to let the tool do the work. Just carefully work up to the pencil line drawn and it will be very accurate. The headlight holes are cut out with a step bit. The design has a recess where a 3D printed ring can be glued in place. Before I start making the vacuum molds, I decided to scratch build the bed. It's mostly straight pieces, but there are some areas which need to be vacuum formed parts, like the fenders. Since the drawings are printed off to scale, the easiest thing is to cut them up into the shapes you need and just trace them directly onto the part. It also makes it easier since I was asked to stretch the bed a bit. The original scaled length is a bit shorter, but the customer wanted it to fit an existing chassis. I accomplished this by adding a bit before and after the fender. Once complete, you'll never be able to tell. Most of the build for the bed is traditional scratch building techniques. If you're just starting, this is the best thing to do. The shapes are relatively simple and it allows for a lot of practice in cutting and fitting pieces to shape. I've even built these simple beds to go with the Lexan cab. Many of the trucks are separate, so doing it is relatively easy. You just need to take your time with the shapes and make sure you measure out things as accurately as possible. These lower pieces are just 2 strips of styrene glued at a 90-degree angle before attaching to the bed. I cut each one separate, but if you're not comfortable with getting these aligned, they can be made as one piece from front to back. The center gets cut out later anyway. It's a bit of a waste of material, but still better than having the pieces not aligned properly. I got the cart a bit in front of the horse when working on the lower sections for the bed. I should have stopped and made the fenders first so they could fit together. I was able to make it work, it just made it a little more difficult. A piece was cut to the end shape, and this was finished off with the basic shape of the bed. I cut the top angle portion of the bed from scratch and glued it into place. These get supports to help, but the main connection is where the 2 pieces meet. This is why special care needs to be used to make sure the connection is as tight as possible. The part is cut as close to the final line as possible. My goal is to remove as much material as possible before it gets removed from the mold. This allows me to use the mold to cut straight lines, and it reduces stress on the part during the removal process. In the past, I made the side bed supports from styrene. This is not hard to do, but takes a lot of time. And the big challenge is to make 6 to 8 small pieces look exactly the same. This time, I decided to 3D print them out. The pieces are printed solid, and they are well recessed. I wouldn't add them unless this was the case. I want these bodies to be driven, and if you want, driven hard. Things like 3D printed parts, which can be broken, factor into my build decisions. After getting everything glued into place, some filler is added and rough sanded back. The tailgate was another part I decided to vacuum form. Another 3D print was used for this. After it is cut from the mold, a piece of styrene is glued to close in the back. The fit was pretty good, but some sanding and cutting along the edge was required before the tailgate would drop into place. It was really close, but required a bit of force to get it into place. I noticed that this caused the bed to bow slightly, so getting it to go in easily was critical. Most of the time, the 3D printed parts come out with little to no cleanup. However, the fender molds need a little bit of filler added to the top. This is the 2-part filler and hardens up pretty quickly. It is then sanded down smooth. Parts like this, which are relatively deep and have steep sidewalls, will sometimes cause the styrene to wrinkle when forming. The styrene is hot enough that it will easily fuse into a solid piece again. I still put some solvent glue on just in case before I cut away the wrinkle. After some filler and sanding happens, these will completely disappear. A trick for getting the mold to release is to lift a corner and blow in some compressed air. Most of the time it just breaks the bond between the pieces, but I have had a part fly across the room. .3D printed tailgate hinges were added to some styrene tubing. This gives a very accurate look of the old school tubular tailgate hinge. Now it's time to get to some carving. Mostly this build is a toaster shape, mostly straight sides with some rounded edges. Even with that, care needs to be taken to match the curves correctly. I carved one section at a time and then added a new dimension from the drawing. This is carved into place and I move to the next part. Eventually I will have all the shapes roughed in and I just need to blend them together. The panel I am making is for the front and has a recessed section where the grill is inset. I use my bandsaw to cut out the shape. The insert can be moved down a bit and then glued back into place. I just use some thick CA glue to close up the saw cut on the edge. I try and make recessed areas which line up with the door panel gaps. This is mostly accomplished with a Tamiya scribe tool. The result isn't very deep, but it's enough. I can enhance the depth later with that same scribe tool. The back panel has a thin recessed area, and I accomplish this by adding some styrene to the panel with an appropriately sized cutout hole. Once I fill in the edges and sand back, it will give the look of a recessed panel, even though I'm adding material. The drawings are not always spot on, so I often tweak the actual lines slightly on the final piece. Here I am adjusting the curved section for the door so it visually looks correct. I'm a big proponent of measuring, but in the end, if it looks straight, it is straight. I often take time to think through the process when I'm making the molds. To me, it's worth a few minutes to make sure the fifth or sixth step will work, not just the second one. Taking this time will keep you from being painted into a corner, so to speak. This is why I'm using the styrene to add material instead of just going straight towards removing some, which would cause multiple problems later on. The two-part body filler does a really good job of transitioning between the styrene and MDF. After cutting the side of the Jeep from the mold, the edge needs to be prepped. The tighter the joint, the better the connection will be using solvent glue. I first cut back to the line, then use a large block sander to make it as flat as possible. To help align the butt joints and give a little extra strength, small styrene shapes are glued over the joint. They are then solvent glued before applying a few dabs of CA to help hold it in place while the solvent glue dries up. Typically the floorboard is the easiest part of the build. However, this one is pretty complex. There are multiple levels and a massive engine cover right in the middle. Plus the front of the floorboard curves to match the wheel arches. I start at the back and slowly work my way up to the front, gluing in the panels. The dash curves right up to the front body panel, so a vacuum mold was made to match the front of the body. This was glued in place in preparation for adding the dash later on. The door panels, which are just the inside of the door skin, are 3D printed. I wanted to have a secure spot to mount these and cover up the inside of the body panels between the door panels. A thin piece of styrene is cut to shape and glued on each side. One of the things I like so much about building these trucks is using multiple techniques. My focus is to use whatever method gives me the best result with the least amount of effort. Fusion 360 was used to design a mold of the front floorboard. This area curves around the front wheel wells, so making it as a 3D print just makes sense. Once the styrene is vacuum formed over the mold, you end up with a part that easily drops into place. The pieces between the front and rear section was somewhat fluid. I had a good idea and some decent pictures, but needed to make it up as I went. If this truck gets made again, I would most likely make a mold for this piece now that I have a good idea of how it should be made. The before-mentioned curved floor section is glued on either side of the engine cover. A few more panels were cut to fill in between the rear and the front floorboard section. Multiple small pieces of styrene were then fit to start closing in the area. I was able to use the floorboard molds, which I had 3D printed to cut the curves for some closed-in panels. All these pieces were solvent glued in place before adding on some CA to act as a clamp to hold it together. I've been wanting to try styrene slurry for several years, but just never got around to it. Basically, it is scraps of styrene melted with a solvent. The result is a spreadable material which can be placed along seams and used to fill larger gaps. Once the solvent evaporates, the slurry in the body will have fused into one piece. The last piece to carve is the roof section. I decided to have the roof be removable, just to make it easier to paint the details of the interior. If not, I was going to need to cut a large access panel and all that work I just finished on the floorboard. Several pieces of MDF were carpet taped together and then sanded back to the correct shape. The carpet tape allows a piece to be carved as one monolithic piece, and then later broken apart to vacuum form. It's just a matter of gluing pieces together and then cutting out the window openings. 2 drive shaft set screw pins were mounted on the back and 2 to the front. These pins align with small holes drilled in the body. When you press the pins into the holes, it will keep the body in place no problem. This Jeep is quickly getting out of control. I keep finding more detail to build. It's a very fun project, and I look forward to completing it. I have a few more projects lined up, but until then, I'll see you on the rocks.